Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the work of James Bishop. This is James Bishop's first solo exhibition here at the gallery, and it is his first solo presentation in New York City since 1987. This exhibition features a group of the artist's paintings on canvas ranging from the early 60s up until 1986, after which the artist turned exclusively to smaller scaled paintings on paper, which you'll find here as well. We are very honored today to welcome Carter Ratcliff, who will share his insights on the work. Carter is a writer, poet, and art critic who has authored numerous catalogs on artists, including John Singer Sargent, Jackson Pollock, Andy Warhol, and has written extensively on the work of James Bishop. So we're very pleased to turn the discussion over to Carter and encourage questions at the end of the talk. So thank you all again for joining us, and please welcome Carter.
Thank you all for coming. I am not going to do exactly art historical or possibly even art critical account of Jim's work. More just, I think I want to talk about sort of how to look at the paintings of James Bishop. I suppose that's art critical in a way, but the first thing I'd like you to look at is not the paintings, but the walls. You may notice that they're not standard gallery white. And that was Jim's, I'm going to call him Jim because we've known him forever. And even though he's a quintessentially American painter, but strangely enough, he spent most of his adult life in France. Not being part of the French art scene, but not being part of the American art scene either. Somehow he's one of these American artists, and there are quite a few of them going back to the early days of the Republic, who are what Herman Melville called isolatos. He was referring to Captain Ahab. Jim's nothing like Captain Ahab, but it's an American way of being an artist. I suppose the easiest way, the most familiar word is to say a loner. Not that he's out of touch with things, but that it's not necessary for him to be in contact immediately all the time with what's going on in the immediate present in the art world. Somehow he has an inner vision, inner whatever, that allows him to function and be relevant over all these decades, but not really be part of the scene in a literal sense. And I think that has something to do with his aesthetic, his way of painting, which I'll try to get at. But back to the walls. The night of the opening, he was saying that he has kind of a formula. Well, start with this. The traditional modernist gallery, and there's a series of articles from the 70s by Brian O'Doherty about this called The White Cube, in which he goes on at great length and with much insight about what it meant to take art out of churches, palaces, Victorian drawing rooms, whatever, and put them in stark white cubes. And that's a subject in itself, but just have that in the background of your mind when you realize that, or when you look at the fact that Jim doesn't want that. He didn't want that. This is white mixed with umber. And I'm not a painter, so I said, after we were talking, I want to get this straight. You mean burnt umber? He said, no, raw umber. Very precise. And it's something that he feels is, goes with his paintings. And all of them. It's a remarkable choice to have found for himself precisely the right color for the walls where you see his paintings. Some of his paintings do have stark whites in them, and because he wants to confront that. That's such an important color, stark white. The white on white of Malevich, the whites in Mondrian, If you're a serious abstract painter, you have to deal with it, but he doesn't want to give his art over to it, and over to that idea of purity. These ochres and other colors, you see greens, earth colors of all kinds, umbers, ochres, grays, browns. He calls them impure colors. The idea being that he doesn't want that clarity of the primaries that you see in Mondrian, or in certain pop art, or in certain minimalist art. He wants colors that you can't quite pin down. He wants colors that have ambiguities built into them. And you ask yourself, why would you want to do that? Most people who create things want their message to be clear. And it's one of the characteristics, I think, of a certain kind of art that, I mean, this is putting it negatively, but that he wants things to be unclear. As I say, that's putting it negatively. The positive way of putting it would be to say that he sees a value in ambiguity. He sees a value in complexity. He sees a value in colors and images and the relationship between shape and color and so on that you can't get in one glance. I mean, one of the, whether you like him or hate him, one of the obvious characteristics of an Andy Warhol, an early Andy Warhol anyway, is that you could get it in one glance. And then there were other things you could do. You could think about it. Try to say, why on earth would anyone paint a Campbell soup can? But, and there are a lot of interesting answers to that question, but there's not an awful lot to do in the way of looking at most pop art. And though some would disagree, I'd say that about most minimalist art, which brings me back to Jim. There are a number of painters, Robert Ryman, Bryce Marden, David Novros, Ellsworth Kelly, who've been called minimalists, you know, colleagues of Donald Judd with his boxes, Carl Andre with his grids on the floor. And Jim is one of them for the plausible reason that you see these clear geometric shapes in his paintings. But then if you could look at them for a bit, they're not all that clear. What's not so clear is the relationship between this sort of house form and the overall canvas. It's not fitting onto it in a symmetrical way. The canvas is nearly symmetrical, the form is nearly symmetrical, but they're not locked into each other in the way a minimalist symmetry would be. So there's a complexity right there, just in the placement of the image or the divisions of the surface in relation to the overall surface. Things are a bit clearer in this painting, but you see his decision to set this set of quadrants apart from this set of quadrants. And then, almost invisible, a bar. It's almost not a different color, it's more like just a different texture down here. These are very much handmade. Part of minimalism was that you could have the work fabricated. You would send it out to a factory, basically. And that's why minimalism led in a very short series of steps to conceptualism, because it was driven by the concept. You could think your way to a minimalist form. You can't think your way to these forms. You have to experience your way to these forms. You have to live your, I mean, living, it's an extraordinary process to just this shift of texture here. To do that physically it's a kind of, I'm tempted to say, it sounds a little overblown, I'm tempted to say it's a kind of life experience. And Jim, he's very unassuming in demeanor, he's not a modest person. I think you can feel from these paintings he's a very ambitious person. But he has said things like artists should not be seen or heard, except of course for opera singers. Which is, but he said extraordinarily interesting things about his art and about art in general. One of the things he says is, life is complex, so perhaps art should be complex too. And that's a kind of irony there too, because he doesn't mean perhaps. He says perhaps painting should be complex too, or art should be complex too, but what he means is, of course it should be complex too. I mean, he's from a generation before minimalism, before pop, before the appearance on the scene of images that you get in one glance. He's from a generation, he calls himself a member of the quieter branch of abstract expressionism. Now, when you think of de Kooning or Franz Klein, and then look at these paintings, it's not immediately clear why Jim would call himself an abstract expressionist. And perhaps there's a bit of irony there too. There's a bit of irony in just about everything he says. But what he means is that these images come out of the experience of painting them. And the decisions are made in the course of painting them. Of course, he'll have an idea to begin with. I'm sure he knew when he started that he wanted to pretty clearly divide it in half. But who knows when the later decisions came. And it's very likely, just from the feel of it, that they came in the course of making the painting. And so what he hopes for, I wrote a piece quite a while ago talking about Jim Bishop painting for the perfect viewer. In other words, an artist with a kind of faith that somewhere, that sometime, there would be somebody who would actually see everything in the painting, every nuance, get every point that he was making in a visual way, not necessarily be able to translate it into words, but to respond fully. I wouldn't write that now because I think the idea of a perfect viewer is kind of silly, but when I was here, I hadn't seen his paintings for a long time. When I was here the night of the opening, it occurred to me, just came to me, that he does have this extraordinary faith in our ability to look and to pay attention. And that he just assumes that there's going to be an audience. It's the kind of art that creates its audience. You can't paint for that audience. You have to paint and then the audience finds you. It's a different way of approaching things from other artists and certainly other kinds of creativity. If you think of the way movies are made or you think of the way certain kinds of books are written, you conceive of an audience first of all, or you locate an audience and then you do something for that audience. Jim, to get back to the idea of him as an isolato in Melville's terms, a person who's extraordinarily independent, doesn't go about it that way. The work comes first and then the audience finds its way to the work. Let's see, why don't we go into the other room and we can look at some other things that he does. I wanted to look at this one in particular because of this configuration. There are a number of things that people have said about this because, believe me, as an art critic, the problem is always, to find something to say that's more or less plausible. And one of the more or less plausible things you could say about this is that there's a reference here to window frames. Another more or less plausible thing to say is that he's giving on the surface of the canvas a reflection of the stretcher bars on the other side of the canvas. It's not quite as plausible, but it's something you can say, and it has been said. I believe that in talking about art and writing about art, responding to art, it's not a question of getting it right or getting it wrong. Some responses are more interesting and plausible than others, but I don't think, strictly speaking, let's say, speaking from a strictly logical point of view, that you can rule out any interpretation, no matter how bizarre it may seem to you. Because that's not how art works. Art is not a proposition that leads to a conclusion that's either right or wrong. A work of art is an occasion for experience. And you can't really, well, you can, but I don't think you should, just reject other people's experience. You know, I mean, people have a right to their reaction to art. If it's art, there are other things where you can get it right and you can get it wrong. For example, when you see a poster with Uncle Sam saying, what does it say, America wants you, it's pretty clear what the message is. And it would be pretty clear if somebody got that message wrong. That's propaganda. You go to the homicide bureau in the police department, they show you a photograph and they say, this shows that so-and-so was there on the night of the crime. Now, it may do that or it may not, but it's either right or wrong. That's documentary, that's evidence. It can be, not that evidence can't be ambiguous, but the point of evidence of one kind or another is to get to a firm conclusion that you can defend logically. And there are other kinds of visual images, other kinds of writing, where it's right or wrong. You know, you can make a case for that. But what characterizes art, I've come to feel, is that that's not an issue. Art, as I say, is an occasion for experience. And I particularly like Bishop's work because he seems, in his roundabout way, to agree with me. In other words, he does a kind of art that it seems to me, if you spend some time with it, you realize there's no one right thing to say about it. There's no conclusion. He's not making a point. He's providing a field into which you can wander. And he has said that he's a little impatient about these interpretations of forms like these as window panes. He said, well, the only reason I do is just to make it a bit more complex. He wants to generate complexity. He wants to do it without becoming a member of the noisy. He says he's part of the quiet side of abstract expression. He doesn't, for temperamental reasons, just because he is who he is, he doesn't want to be on the noisy side, the theatrical side of abstract expressionism. But he does want to throw things open in the way that Klein, de Kooning, Pollock, and all those people did. So that what this allows him to do is just, I would say, there's an infinite range of ambiguities within this delimited frame. There's no end to looking at this. You can perhaps exhaust yourself looking at it, but there's no end to it. And I want to quote something from an interview of his where he talks about things in a very general way, but I think in a suggestive way. He's talking about his painting, just in general, the kind of color, its heaviness or lightness, its transparencies, its spatial ambiguities. And then this is a shift. He says, a kind of a mood, a light, and what that says about life, mine or yours. Now, the interesting turn here is when he goes from things that you can see, like the degrees of transparency, lightness and darkness, the different weights of the color, the shifts of the color, et cetera, to a kind of a mood. And that's a very mysterious thing. I don't think people as far back as the time of Aristotle have been talking about it. He talked about it in music, but it's also true in painting and in poetry. The meaning somehow is in the feeling that it engenders. And how that works, as I say, no one's ever pinned that down. They've had 2.5 millennia to do it, and they haven't done it yet. But we know it happens. We know how we feel with certain pieces of music. We know how certain kinds of paintings make us feel. How if we get into it, and that's always a question, if one does or doesn't, you know. But if one does, you get into this, and then you go look at Autumn Rhythm by Pollock, you know, you're in a different emotional world, you know. And then where he says, what that says about life, mine or yours. So he's as he pursues his interest in these purely, I shouldn't say purely because he prefers the word impure, not as a negative, but as a positive. So that takes a bit of an imaginative leap to think how, in thinking about the aesthetic of Jim Bishop, how does impurity become a virtue? You know, what he means is, it's the richness of the ambiguity, the complexity, the questions it raises, the impossibility of settling the questions one way or another. And then finally you can't spend your whole life looking at this. At a certain point, you have to stop looking at it, and you take something away from it. And the part where he says about my life or yours, you may intuitively, or perhaps you can put words to it, realize that there's been something that's been revealed about yourself in your response to it, your emotional response. But then it doesn't always happen. I mean, you know, it depends. And when I was, in that long ago article, when I was talking about the perfect viewer, I guess I must have been thinking how often it must happen that viewers are baffled or don't get into it. And that Jim's extraordinary faith that there will be people who do is remarkable in itself. And furthermore, I think ultimately his faith is justified. I think maybe now more than then, we can see our way, and better than that, feel our way into these paintings. Because there's been so much since then. So many different kinds of art. Pop art, minimalism, politically oriented art, theatrical sort of installations and so on. You know, just an amazing variety of things, and we all have different responses to that great range of art that's developed since. Because when Jim started painting and sculpture were the primary media, and they've been challenged by any number of other media. Some of them intangible, like conceptual art. Some of them, as I was suggesting before, theatrical, like certain kinds of installation art or performance art. And so I think, though I'm not in sympathy with a lot of that art, I really care about painting more than anything else. I think it's been good for painting to have those challenges, because it's clearer what we're looking at. I mean, in a certain way, because when you see the alternatives to painting, then painting becomes clearer somehow. And in an odd way, I think painting has benefited from all these challenges. Not that Jim paid any attention to any of that, but he continued in his way to do what he started doing in the early 60s, and it's just become richer and more extraordinary as it's gone along. Now at a certain point, I want to say something about the size of these, because then we should look at those smaller ones. They're, again, in purity, they look square, but most of them are not exactly square. I think there's something in that too to ponder, because a Carl Andre 12 by 12 plate is 12 by 12. I mean, there's no question about that. You could use them as a measuring device. But these are just, you can't see it exactly. Maybe you can feel it in some cases. Or maybe the configuration works against it, so it really does look square. Absolutely square. You know, I mean, there are all sorts of variations. You really have to spend time with each one of the paintings and sort of get its own logic, and then its relationship to all the other paintings in the oeuvre. But this size, let's say they're square. They're roughly, almost precisely square. 72 inches by 72, up to 76 by 76. And as he's pointed out, that's at the higher end of the range, that's a little taller than he is. And the width then becomes just a little beyond what he can, reach by reaching out like this. So they have that human scale. They have an architectural feel sometimes, because, let's face it, whatever Jim says, you can't help seeing some sort of built structure in this, But it's scaled to his presence. And that's extremely important, because he's addressing us at what that means, I guess this is putting it metaphorically, but what that means is his presence in the painting is addressing us at our scale as we are in front of it immediately looking at it. So it's a kind of one-to-one exchange. A contrast would be a huge Pollock or an even huger Richard Serra piece, But this is at our scale, and that's part of what he's up to. He wants to address us one-on-one. And then at a certain point, it may have had to do with his getting older, he started doing things on smaller pieces of paper. I think mostly what I want to say about these, well, there are two things. There's a shift. These works on paper, these are all, as you say, blue. They're shades of grayish blue. Others are more grayish than blue. But again, it's these impure colors, these colors that have complexity built into them, so that the longer you look at it, the more gray you see, or with the gray ones the other way around, the more blue you see, whatever. And then there are others with still other colors. But he talked about how at a certain point it made more sense to him, felt right, to work from the wrist, not from the shoulder. And I think it might have been just a matter of at a certain age that made sense. But you can't all see it. Maybe you've all looked at them, but they have these small configurations within them. And so what's going on is the relationship between the overall shape and what this surface delimited by that shape contains. Plus, this extraordinary nuance in the drawing and in the laying on of color. So what I'd say about these is that, remarkably, he's managed to, these are in their own way, because there's a difference between size and scale. Minimalism wanted to persuade us to just see everything at the literal size that it is. And there are large works. I mentioned those big Serra pieces that you can walk into. And there are others, installation pieces that in another way you can walk into, where its size and scale are pretty much the same. Your sense of how big it is determined by how big, in fact, it is. Yeah. But, there are those Constable cloud studies that are about this size, although they're usually horizontal. He manages to get the whole sky into them. So they're small in size, but they're huge in scale. And these are not small in size, but huge in scale. I think they're small in size, but at the same scale as the big paintings. And that's remarkable. It has to do with the extraordinary delicacy and the nuance of the placement of the form on the surface. I'm not sure we'd think that if these were the only ones we'd ever seen, but having seen those and understanding these as something that came after, I think we see that he's maintained this scale, a human scale, that these are not miniatures. They're small, but they're not miniatures. At that point, are there any questions or comments? Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Okay.
I looked at Mr. Bishop's work several times. I looked at it closely. And, when I see the process, seemingly layers and layers and layers, how would you describe his work in terms of the planned and the unplanned in terms of process?
That's a very good question, because as you may have intuited by looking at them, talked about that bar that you could just barely see in the other room along the bottom of the painting, or the bottom half of the painting. That's done with a brush. But a lot of these are done with poured paint. The paint is diluted with turpentine, and he tilts the surface. And he said explicitly, it's as though I can answer for your question from him, that he likes that because when he was doing it, he liked it because it meant that he wasn't absolutely in control, so that there could be accidents. And not all the accidents were accepted. I'm sure there are paintings he threw out. I'm sure that he wiped away certain things that didn't work. And I think some of these edges may have been produced by wiping paint while it was still wet. But the process includes the possibility of being surprised by an accident, by something that he couldn't have anticipated. And again, that's a kind of impurity. I mean, there's certain kinds of minimalism and conceptualism that seem to be devoted to what I would call a Platonic idea, absolutely pure and describable idea of what? A cube, a grid, a certain concept in conceptual art. That, in the Western tradition, you relate that to Plato and his idea of truth that somehow transcends all the ambiguities, all the complexities, all the doubts of ordinary life and gets to a pure place. Jim's not interested in that. He's interested in being in our world with all its ambiguities and complexities, and possibility, again, for being surprised. And that's built into his method. Any other questions? Yeah.
I was going to say, as a painter, you can think you're in control.
Oh, right, yeah.
None
Yeah.
of us are ever completely in control.
Yeah, yeah.
During the process, living the process, no
Yeah.
matter how you pour or paint or whatever,
Yeah, yeah.
things will come up that are a total surprise.
Yeah,
Even
yeah.
if you think you have it all.
Even if you think you have it all. That's probably true of minimalists too, but they won't admit it.
I think it's true of
Yes.
life in general.
Yeah, of life in general, yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a purity in that, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, or at least an honesty. I mean, of accepting that.
Right.
You know. Yeah.
Other than the shift in size, can you talk about other ways that Bishop has developed or even gotten better?
Well, I think that I don't know that you'd say he's gotten better, but I think that the demands that these smaller works make on you, on your ability to pay attention, to perceive, to feel what you're seeing, not just to see it, but to feel it. I think that these later works make greater demands, and that's a kind of development. They're more austere. You do have to make that metaphorical leap, imaginative leap, to understanding these as being not merely small, but really large in scale, and these are more demanding. I guess that's what I would say. Beyond that, then you have to go into really minute detail, and that's where critics become really very boring, because it's because it's so hard to talk about these visual nuances in a way that is interesting. The interest is in seeing them. And I think this is true in music too. I mean, you can say large things about the structure of a sonata or whatever, but when it comes to what it really means and what the quality of the experience is, at a certain point you just have to have the experience, you know. And perhaps these are more demanding than some of his earlier works. But then again, perhaps not. I mean, it's not, you know. I think that would depend on the individual viewer, you know, a matter of taste.
Question for you. I was wondering what you thought about his use of the edges or the framing. Like a lot of, like for instance, paintings like from Pollock suggested moving out beyond the edge, and his seem very contained.
They do.
And they don't move
Yeah.
outside of the edge.
I agree with
It
that.
gives them a
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
weight
Yeah. Yeah.
and beauty.
Yeah, well,
Very contained.
it's that your word weight. He was in that quote that those just few words of his. He does talk about the different weights of the paint, and it's interesting that it can be so delicate and yet seem so solid, almost monumental sometimes. And I think you're right. He doesn't do what Clifford Still did, Pollock did. That was called all-over painting. And the idea of it was that it completely did away with traditional kinds of composition that are contained within the frame. And so even where a Pollock, you can see that he notices the frame and he swerves away from it. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. But in a certain way, he's not treating the frame as a premise that will organize the interior of the image. So it might, it could be, it does have this sort of centrifugal quality. But one of the functions, and I'm glad you mentioned this because I didn't, of those bars that some people identify with the stretcher bars or with architectural elements, it's precisely to do that, to establish the geometry, the prevailing geometry, and it is contained. And I think that has to do with his sense of the scale of it. He wants it to be human. Pollock said, "I am nature." Nature is boundless,
Right.
I don't think Pollock was nature, but I think his paintings do have a boundless quality to them, even when they are clearly contained by the frame. But Jim's are contained, not confined, not constrained in any way, but they seem totally coincident with the surface where they are, totally at home there, and that becomes that's part of what makes them convincing at a human scale.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you. Oh,
Just one more observation. With the earlier Ford painting of people like Frankenheimer, you can see the oil residue, as a shadow.
oh, right, yeah.
Shapes, but you don't see any of that.
I know you don't see that. That's.
This isn't soap, it's on primed canvas.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah, no, Frankenthal.
Yeah, that
raw
would. Yeah,
cotton
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think
That's
that
why
would be
she
right.
switched to acrylic.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's no bare canvas, so there's no place for that halo to develop.
Well, there's bare primed canvas in some of these.
Uh-huh.
Some of the white is just primed canvas,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
but it's not raw. It's
yeah.
ready to
Right.
paint on.
Yeah. Ah, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.